Before the headlines, before the raid, a man in a lab coat with a broad smile and big ideas worked in Michigan's anatomy program. His name was Arthur Rathburn, and colleagues called him energetic, charismatic, the guy with solutions. That's where our story starts. So, I wanted to start this series with something that hits a little close to home. So, I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, and both of my parents worked at Detroit Metro Airport. My mom specifically worked in cargo. She told me stories of her seeing polar bears being transported to zoos, luxury cars flying to a billionaire summer home, and even human body parts from a suspicious man named Arthur Rathburn. Now, she didn't have any proof that he wasn't on the up and up. His paperwork was right, and he's made countless deliveries before. However, something was giving my mom a very bad feeling and foreshadowing, but my mom is a very good judge of character. In 1984, Rathburn joined the University of Michigan's body donation program. He was prepping cadavers for anatomy classes and research, and he was just 30 years old. Community college educated, but still relentless in the lab. Supervisors praised his work ethic. They said he had a charisma about him and a lot of ideas. And one of those ideas became a scientific publication and a patent, a state of the art embalming and autopsy station, promising safer, easier preparation of the dead. He was often featured in the Ann Arbor Observer, posing in a tie and lab coat, telling a whimsical story about how a $10 bet nudged him into funerary work. Yeah, I'd have a lot of regrets if I was the guy that made that bet. But in 1990, his time there ended. Records sealed by court order, with sources later alleging he mishandled donor ashes, which was a cardinal sin in the field, and a unfortunate trend of sin would soon follow. By the early 1990s, Rathburn had crossed into the body broker world. He supplied remains to research labs and surgical seminars. A longtime associate recalls making pretty straightforward requests, such as, I need half a dozen human heads. Creepy? Absolutely. But for non transplant use, often legal under a patchwork of state rules. He ran events in New Orleans, San Francisco, and Chicago, transporting parts in ice chests wrapped and labeled so clinicians could practice. And to many outsiders, this looked like the grisly back end of medical education. From January 2007 until December 2013, authorities said Arthur and Elizabeth Rathburn ran International Biological Inc., a Detroit area corporation that purchased donated bodies from biological resource centers and rented them to researchers. In 2005, Rathburn made an ambitious move. $1.8 million for a funeral home and warehouse in Richmond, Virginia. Now, the location was strategic, near interstate exits and convention centers, and of course, a medical school. Perfect, he thought, for storing cadavers and running training events. But, shockingly enough, the locals pushed back. Hard. I know I would. If something like this moved in my neighborhood, I think that the home value would plummet. The plan collapsed and the debts piled up. By late 2008, his company filed for bankruptcy, reporting over $70,000 in assets against over 600 grand in debts, including over 200,000 in back taxes. And now let's get into the inventory list, the most chilling asset sheet you'll ever read. He got 91 heads, 18 spines, 6 hips, plus a copy of the Hippocratic Oath for good measure. He pegged the market value of the parts at about $160,000. Human bodies bring in $10,000 to $100,000. Brains alone, $600, and elbows and hands, $850, according to court records. Despite bankruptcy, Rathburn kept operating. What's something like a little bankruptcy to stop a savvy businessman like Rathburn? From 2005 to 2013, brokers shipped him hundreds of parts, and his business continued. At least one broker voiced concern during this period. Walter Mitchell, former owner of BioGift, an Oregon body donation firm, said he stopped supplying body parts to Rathburn after a 2006 incident. A week after shipping two human torsos to Rathburn in Detroit, Mitchell got a call from the airline that transported them. No one had picked up the packages at the airport. According to Mitchell, the coolers are leaking and it smells. Now, America's tightest controls on body brokers arguably sit in New York. Inspectors traveled to his Detroit warehouse in 2004 and found serious problems. Most notably, no proof that whole bodies and segments were willingly donated. Rathburn argued that privacy rules and supplier policies blocked sharing consent forms. New York didn't buy it. They restricted his shipments until collective action and later allowed limited operations via provisional license. Meanwhile, from 2010 through 2013, border agents repeatedly flagged shipments, 10 human heads at a time crossing from Canada. In one instance, a package included a severed sausage. Yet the warehouse raid didn't happen until December 2013. The gap between warnings and action let business continue, and that's where the larger system begins to look broken. You see, when agents finally entered, they reported thousands of body parts. Human heads stacked directly on top of each other with no protective barrier. They were frozen together like meat patties at a shitty diner. Coolers with red liquid, and that liquid, it wasn't Fago. At the Detroit airport in 2012, when confronted, Rathburn allegedly told agents that a similar red liquid was simply Listerine used to preserve the specimens and keep their mouths minty fresh. Yeah, investigators say that shockingly wasn't true. Witnesses said Arthur Rathburn kept a filthy warehouse with bodies stored skin to skin and used a crowbar to separate them. Dead insects and blood littered the floor where the bodies were stored. It was discovered Rathburn dismembered the bodies with a well-oiled chainsaw, bandsaw, and a reciprocating saw. A far cry from the sterilized tools that are traditionally used in the industry. Durkee, a former employee, said one day when he and Arthur Rathburn were entering the warehouse, they noticed a squirrel had gotten trapped beneath the rolling gate. Rathburn took a stick and beat it to death, and then put it in the freezer with the body parts. Rathburn said, "It's good eats." Durkee said the warehouse lost power for 3 days once. The remains thawed, and they smelled, and the bodily fluids leaked out. He said Rathburn didn't clean the freezer floor and that the bodily fluids froze in place after power was restored. Federal agents even discovered 4 preserved fetuses in the Detroit warehouse. The fetuses, which appeared to have been in their second trimester, were submerged in a liquid that included human brain tissue. Now, I'm not going to show the photos of this because they are absolutely horrifying, but I'll describe them to you. If you'd like to skip this, this is the timestamp. In 4 of the photos, a crime scene investigator in a hazmat suit uses forceps to lift a fetus from the brown liquid. In 3 other photos, a marker that includes a government evidence identification number lies beside a fetus. So 7 months later, prosecutors allege he sent a cadaver infected with hepatitis B and HIV to a Washington, D.C. medical convention. No attendees were harmed, but they wouldn't learn about the potential exposure for years. In January 2016, authorities arrested Rathburn. The government called it a significant step in policing brokers who dissect and lease remains for profit. An industry often fueled by donations from families who receive free cremation and believe that they're contributing to science. Rathburn faced charges of defrauding healthcare workers and lying to federal agents. Notably, he wasn't charged with selling or dissecting human remains, because in America, selling non-transplant body parts is not a federal crime. During the investigation, Rathburn's mortuary license was terminated. So, in order to pay the bills,
A Grosse Pointe Park man at the center of an FBI investigation for selling bodies in the black market had a yard sale.
he set up a folding table outside of his warehouse and set up a morbid garage sale, selling his remaining assets. And now, fortunately, the body parts were confiscated already, but he did sell the coolers that they were once stored in. So, pending trial, Rathburn did what every Michigander does when they want to get away. He went up north. Now, he wasn't going on vacation. Instead, he was working on his latest business venture, creating genetically engineered trophy deer to be hunted on his 1,000-acre farm. Dude, just get a normal job. So we'll have to be patient for those genetically engineered deer, because Arthur Rathburn was officially arrested and charged in January of 2016. So he pleaded not guilty and remained jailed pending trial. His ex-wife, who may or may not have more to do with this, allegedly, she pleaded guilty to one count of fraud and cooperated with the prosecutors. When asked why Rathburn's ex-wife Elizabeth and her ex-husband did not disclose to customers that the body parts they were buying were infected with HIV and hepatitis, she said, because we would have lost the contract. At trial, Rathburn's lawyers argued that the grotesque images swayed the jury's decision. The images were so horrifying that one juror requested counseling and was released from their jury duty. We have 10,000 diseases in the world. We know how to treat 500 of them. The rest need to be studied. Rathburn was sentenced in May of 2018 to serve 9 years in federal prison. But because of good behavior, he was released in 5, being released in November of 2023. I could imagine his good behavior being that he couldn't find a lot of body parts. And I know he didn't kill anybody or anything, but I think that the sentence was ridiculously light for the level of disturbing this was.
The bomb got dropped on me that my father's head is sitting in the FBI freezer. Not something I wanted to hear.
Obviously, you have no shame. I hope you rot in hell. Make sure you tell the devil I sent you.
Glorious Pearl Jeffries, a 72-year-old wedding planner, donated her body believing it would educate others. Later, her daughter heard the words no one wants to hear. A head, 2 legs, and a shoulder distributed throughout the warehouse. Her head was not cremated, but sitting on a shelf. At Case Western Reserve University, staff later learned a head supplied by Rathburn in 2013 for neurosurgery training, it couldn't be traced to a donor. So feeling betrayed, they formed a committee. They studied the industry and they tightened policies, leasing only from pre-screened brokers who follow national accreditation standards. Now, you might be asking yourself, where did Rathburn even get these bodies? If many had no records indicating their consent for donating towards medical research, how did he acquire them? Well then, let me introduce you to Rathburn's supplier, Biological Resource Center of Arizona. BRC was a body donating program that would frequently sell diseased body parts to Rathburn at a large discount. 10 tons of frozen human remains were confiscated by federal hazmat teams from the BRC. 281 heads, 241 shoulders, 337 legs, and 97 spines are just some of the inventory. And it's absolutely disgusting that these remains of human lives, they were human beings with full lives and loved ones, are simply reduced to inventory for a demonically greedy business. There were over 140 body bags holding parts. Very few bags were actually holding whole bodies. I can't imagine how traumatizing that was for the agents clearing that warehouse. And I'm sure they've worked on some disturbing crime scenes before, but the absolute scale of this must have been its own kind of unique trauma. Now, one of the most disgusting things that agents found was a woman's head sewn onto a man's torso, like Frankenstein. It was hung on the wall like a horrifying taxidermy trophy on display. Stephen Gore, fitting name, was the owner and director of the BRC. He was a former insurance salesman who decided to get into the business because he had the stomach for it, apparently. A year after BRC's raid, Stephen Gore was arrested, and in October of 2015, he pleaded guilty of one charge of illegally conducting an enterprise by willingly providing diseased and contaminated tissues to vendors and using the donor's body against their wishes. BRC sold these bodies to any organization willing to pay, ignoring the wishes of the deceased. Jim Stouffer's mother, Doris, who had passed away from Alzheimer's, donated her body to aid in Alzheimer's research. Instead, BRC sold her remains to the United States military.
She was then supposedly strapped in a chair on some sort of an apparatus, and a detonation took place underneath her to basically kind of get an idea of what the human body goes through when a vehicle is hit by an IED.
Every time I would dream about my mom, I told you she was a quiet person. This person in my dream was angry.
Jim received a box of ashes only to find out that those ashes did not belong to his mother. Stephen Gore was sentenced to 1 year in prison, 4 years probation, and ordered to pay $100,000 in restitution. The court erupted in anger. Most of the audience was filled with family members having been desecrated by Stephen Gore. So let's zoom out and look at the industry as a whole. Selling or leasing body parts for non-transplant uses is not a federal crime. Oversight is state by state, and most states have little or no regulation. Only 10 states provide meaningful oversight, and the rules, they differ widely. Some require licensing or disclosure, and others demand prior approvals or inspections. A few laws exist but are unfunded, let alone enforced. Virginia and Florida often require advance permission before parts enter the state, and Oklahoma and Oregon emphasize regular inspections and stringent record keeping. In New Jersey, a 2008 law aimed at nonprofits wasn't implemented due to a lack of funding, and Maine requires registration but never wrote rules because no one's ever applied. In 2004, after scandals including secret cadaver sales and military landmine experiments on donated bodies, a federal health advisory panel urged national standards like those for organs. But the recommendation wasn't implemented. Reporters later identified more than 2,000 body parts tied to brokers that were misused, abused, or desecrated. Even the U.S. Army used heads, arms, and legs in blast tests without the donor's permission. Even one from a veteran who explicitly refused military experimentation. The Army said it was deceived by the suppliers, which, if the suppliers were anything like Rathburn, I'm kind of believing the Army on this one. So how did we get here? For centuries, anatomy relied on the bodies of society's most vulnerable, the executed prisoners, the handicapped, victims of grave robbery. Doctors and students took for dissection the bodies of the losers of society, said Michael Sapple, a former National Library of Medicine historian and author of A Traffic of Dead Bodies. Until the 1950s, most were not consensual, and they were minorities. Public attitude toward body donation evolved slowly. Sapple said, as medical discoveries help fortify people's beliefs in the authority of doctors and medicine to improve lives. The Uniform Anatomical Gift Act focused on organ transplantation and not the commercial trade in non-transplant parts. So families today are often surprised to learn that once a body is donated, legal control over specific uses is limited. Instructions can function more like a guidance than enforceable commands. So if you or a loved one wants to donate a body to science, here's how to protect intent and dignity. Ask about accreditation and audits. Which national standards are followed? Can they share inspection or audit results? Demand chain of custody transparency. How is consent tracked from donor to specific parts and uses? Who can lease and receive remains? Set explicit limits in writing. Prohibit uses you don't want. An example is the military blast tests. And how will limits be enforced? Verify state oversight. Is there licensing, inspections, reporting where you live? And what about out-of-state shipments? Confirm final disposition. When and how will cremation occur? Will the family receive timely notification and the ashes? Arthur Rathburn's path from a promising lab tech to the center of a national scandal reveals how fragile trust can be when laws lag behind reality. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know I've been gone for a long time, but it's so good to be back. I'm going to be doing more content similar to this, true crime, horror movie reviews, anything of the spooky and the macabre. I might even do a book or two. So if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and I hope you have a great rest to your morning, afternoon, or evening.